It was the dead of winter, and the wilderness was blanketed in a layer of snow so thick and unyielding that it muffled all sound. Trees stood like sentinels, their branches burdened with ice, their shadows stretching long in the weak sunlight. Jake, a rugged man in his early 40s, was trekking through the woods, his breath a constant plume of vapor in the frigid air. Jake wasn't out there for leisure. He was a ranger, responsible for monitoring the wildlife and ensuring the ecosystem thrived. His job was lonely, but he found solace in the quiet of nature. That day, however, the stillness was unnerving. Something wasn't right. As he trudged through the knee-deep snow, he heard it, a faint, guttural growl carried on the wind. He froze, ears straining to pinpoint the sound. Then it came again, a mix of pain and frustration, like an animal in distress. Jake adjusted his scarf, tightened his grip on his hiking pole, and followed the sound. Each step was a labor, but he pressed on, his heart pounding as the cries grew louder. Finally, he saw it, a massive brown bear struggling in the snow. The bear's paw was clamped tightly in a rusted steel trap. Blood stained the pristine snow, a crimson contrast to the white. The bear thrashed and growled, its eyes wild with fear and pain. Jake's stomach churned at the sight. Poachers, the very people he was trying to keep out of these woods, had left this cruel device behind. "Easy, big guy," Jake murmured, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. He had no weapons, no tranquilizers, just his wits and the tools in his backpack. But he couldn't leave the animal there to suffer. Jake assessed the situation carefully. The bear was enormous, a grizzly with muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Even injured, it was a deadly creature. But the pain in its eyes spoke volumes. It wasn't a mindless predator. It was a living, breathing being that didn't deserve to suffer. Jake rummaged through his backpack, pulling out a sturdy rope, a first aid kit, and a pair of gloves. He'd seen bears before, but never this close. His heart raced as he edged closer, speaking in a low, calm voice. "I'm here to help," he said softly, not sure the bear could understand his tone. "You've got to trust me." The bear growled, baring its teeth, but it didn't lunge. It was too exhausted, its energy drained by the relentless struggle against the trap. Jake took a deep breath and inched closer. Using the rope, he fashioned a makeshift snare to secure the bear's neck from a safe distance. He hated doing this. It felt like another act of control, but it was the only way to protect himself while he worked. The bear roared in protest as the rope tightened around its neck, its massive body twisting in the snow. Jake's muscles strained as he anchored the rope to a nearby tree, giving himself just enough slack to approach without getting mauled. With the bear restrained, Jake examined the trap. The steel jaws had dug deep into the bear's paw, and every movement caused it to bleed more. Jake's hands shook as he pulled out his multi-tool. "Hold still, buddy," he muttered, though he knew the bear couldn't obey. The trap was old, its springs rusted but still strong. Jake gritted his teeth and began prying it open, sweat forming on his brow despite the freezing cold. After what felt like an eternity, the trap gave way with a metallic snap. The bear let out a guttural growl that reverberated through Jake's chest. He scrambled back, releasing the rope as the animal stumbled free. For a moment, man and beast locked eyes. Jake's heart pounded as he braced himself for an attack. But the bear didn't charge. It stood there, panting heavily, its wounded paw trembling in the snow. Jake swallowed hard and reached into his backpack for the first aid kit. He didn't know if the bear would let him get close again, but he had to try. He unwrapped a roll of bandages and held it up like a peace offering. "Let me help," he said, his voice steady but low. To his astonishment, the bear didn't move. It watched him with wary eyes as he inched closer, step by step. Jake knelt in the snow, his hands trembling as he reached for the injured paw. The wound was deep, but not fatal. Jake cleaned it as best he could with antiseptic wipes, flinching every time the bear growled in discomfort. Then he wrapped the paw tightly with the bandages, creating a makeshift splint to stabilize it. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. That should hold for now. The bear lowered its massive head, its breaths coming in heavy puffs of steam. For a moment, it almost looked grateful. Jake blinked, unsure if he was imagining things. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. Jake knew he couldn't leave the bear alone in this state. Predators would smell the blood, and the bear was in no condition to defend itself. Jake built a small fire, the flames crackling and sending warmth into the icy air. The bear watched him from a few feet away, its eyes reflecting the firelight. Jake spoke to it as he worked, his voice a soothing balm against the silence. "You're lucky I found you," he said, chuckling softly. "Not many people would take this kind of risk, you know." The bear huffed, its massive shoulders rising and falling. Jake took it as a sign of agreement, even if it was just his imagination. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Jake wrapped himself in his thermal blanket, shivering despite the fire. The bear lay down a short distance away, curling its massive body into a ball. It looked oddly vulnerable, like a giant, injured dog. Jake's thoughts drifted as he stared into the flames. He wondered what had driven him to take such a dangerous gamble. Was it guilt, compassion, or something deeper, a connection to this wild, untamed creature that mirrored his own solitude? Morning came with a golden glow that bathed the forest in light. Jake stirred from his fitful sleep, his joints stiff from the cold. The fire had burned out, leaving only a smoldering pile of ash. The bear was still there, its paw bandaged and resting gingerly on the snow. Jake stretched and stood, wincing as his muscles protested. He wasn't sure what to do next. He couldn't take the bear with him, but he couldn't leave it here, either. "All right, big guy," he said, gathering his things. "Time to see if you can walk." To his amazement, the bear stood slowly, testing its weight on the injured paw. It let out a low grunt but managed to stay upright. Jake felt a surge of pride, as if he'd accomplished something extraordinary. He started walking, expecting the bear to stay behind. But when he looked over his shoulder, it was following him. Jake laughed, a sound that echoed through the silent woods. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. The bear huffed in response, its massive frame lumbering through the snow behind him. It wasn't just following. It was staying close, as if it had decided to trust him. Jake felt a strange warmth in his chest, one that had nothing to do with the fire or the rising sun. He'd saved this creature's life, and now it seemed to consider him a friend. But as they made their way through the forest, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. Jake and the bear trudged through the snow-covered forest, their breath forming twin clouds in the freezing air. The connection between them grew deeper with each step, though Jake still couldn't believe what was happening. A wild animal, a predator, was walking beside him as though they were partners. But Jake also felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest. The bear's wound was stable for now, but it would need proper care to avoid infection. The closest wildlife rehabilitation center was miles away, and Jake wasn't sure how far the bear could travel. As they stopped to rest near a frozen creek, Jake spoke aloud, more to himself than to the bear. "You've got a lot of fight in you, don't you? But you can't do this alone." The bear, lying on the snow with its injured paw stretched out, looked at Jake with those deep, soulful eyes. For a moment, Jake felt as though the animal understood every word. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small loaf of bread he had brought for his hike. Tearing off a piece, he offered it cautiously. The bear sniffed the air, then lumbered forward and took the bread gently from Jake's hand. Jake chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Guess we're a team now." That night, as they sat under a canopy of stars, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for surviving this encounter but for the unexpected bond he had formed with this creature. The next morning, the air was bitterly cold, and the sky was a dull gray, threatening snow. Jake awoke to find the bear standing a few feet away, its ears twitching as it scanned the forest. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice groggy. The bear let out a low, rumbling growl and took a step toward the tree line. Jake followed its gaze and froze. In the distance, he spotted movement. 2 men with rifles slung over their shoulders. Poachers. Jake's stomach churned. He knew these woods were a hotspot for illegal hunting, but seeing them so close was another matter entirely. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. The bear growled again, louder this time, and Jake placed a calming hand on its shoulder. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "We can't let them see us." He led the bear away from the creek, moving as quietly as possible. Every crunch of snow underfoot felt deafening. The bear, surprisingly, followed his lead, its massive body moving with surprising grace. They found shelter behind a rocky outcrop, where Jake peeked out to watch the men. The poachers were examining the area where the trap had been, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. "They're looking for you," Jake whispered to the bear. "We've got to keep moving." The bear huffed, as if in agreement, and together they ventured deeper into the forest, the bond between them growing stronger with every step. Hours passed as Jake and the bear navigated the dense forest. The poachers' voices faded into the distance, but Jake's nerves remained on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Suddenly, the bear stopped, its ears perked and nose sniffing the air. Jake froze, his pulse quickening. "What now?" he muttered. A sharp crack echoed through the forest. A gunshot. Jake's heart dropped. The poachers were closer than he had thought. Before he could react, the bear let out a deafening roar and charged toward the sound. "No!" Jake shouted, running after it. He found the bear standing protectively in front of a small family of deer, its massive frame blocking the path of the poachers. The men had their rifles raised, their eyes wide with fear and determination. "Get out of here!" Jake shouted, stepping into view. The poachers hesitated, their eyes darting between Jake and the bear. One of them muttered, "That thing's injured. It's an easy target." Jake clenched his fists, his fear replaced by a surge of anger. "If you take one more step, you'll have to deal with me and this bear." The bear growled, its eyes blazing with fury. The poachers exchanged nervous glances, then slowly backed away. Jake let out a shaky breath as they disappeared into the trees. The bear turned to him, its body still tense, and Jake placed a hand on its shoulder. "You're one brave soul, you know that." The forest opened up to a small clearing, where a dilapidated cabin stood against the backdrop of towering pines. Jake had discovered it years ago during one of his patrols and had used it as a temporary shelter during storms. "We'll be safe here for the night," he said, leading the bear inside. The cabin was sparse, with a single cot, a wood stove, and a small table. Jake lit a fire in the stove, filling the space with a comforting warmth. The bear settled near the door, its eyes scanning the room. As Jake prepared a simple meal, he couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt to share his space with this wild creature. "You've been through a lot," he said, sitting on the floor beside the bear. "But you're still here. That's something to admire." The bear let out a low rumble, almost like a purr, and Jake smiled. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jake lay awake, his thoughts racing. He knew their journey wasn't over. The poachers would likely return, and the bear still needed proper medical attention. But for now, they had found a moment of peace. The next morning, Jake awoke to the sound of birds chirping, a rare melody in the harsh winter. The bear was already awake, standing at the cabin's window and gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. Jake stretched and stood, his muscles protesting after days of hiking. "Ready to move on?" he asked. The bear turned to him, its eyes calm and steady. Jake felt a pang of emotion he couldn't quite explain. This creature had come to trust him, to rely on him, and he couldn't let it down. As they stepped outside, Jake noticed fresh tracks in the snow, human tracks. His chest tightened. The poachers were still nearby. "We've got to move fast," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. They made their way toward the edge of the forest, where Jake knew a wildlife center operated. It was their best chance at safety. But the journey was treacherous, and the poachers weren't the only threat lurking in the wilderness. As the sun began to set, Jake and the bear reached a frozen river. The ice was thin in places, and Jake's heart raced as he led the bear across, every step a gamble. Halfway across, the ice cracked beneath them. Jake lunged forward, pulling the bear with him as the ice gave way, sending a rush of freezing water cascading over their boots. They reached the other side, soaked and shivering but alive. Jake collapsed on the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear stood beside him, its eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, an unspoken promise that they would get through this together. As dawn broke over the frozen wilderness, Jake and the bear trudged through the snow, their breaths visible in the icy air. Jake's mind raced as he tried to calculate how much farther they had to go. He estimated they were just a few miles from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, but danger loomed with every step. The bear moved cautiously, its ears swiveling at the slightest sound. Jake admired its resilience despite the injury, which had begun to show signs of strain. Just as they crested a hill, Jake heard it, the unmistakable crunch of boots on snow. Before he could react, a voice rang out. "There they are!" Jake spun around to see the poachers emerging from the tree line, their rifles aimed directly at the bear. "No!" Jake shouted, stepping between them. "Leave it alone!" One of the poachers smirked. "That bear's worth a fortune. Step aside, kid." Jake's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "You're not taking another step. This animal is coming with me, and I'll fight you if I have to." The bear let out a fierce roar, its massive frame towering over Jake. For a moment, the poachers hesitated, fear flickering in their eyes. But one of them raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as Jake lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The rifle went off with a deafening crack, the shot echoing through the forest. The other poacher panicked and fled, leaving his partner behind. Jake wrestled the rifle away, his adrenaline surging. The bear stood nearby, watching intently but not attacking. When the man finally scrambled to his feet and ran after his partner, Jake collapsed in the snow, trembling. "Let's go," he muttered to the bear, his voice hoarse. "We're almost there." The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was just over the next ridge. Jake could see the roof of the building through the trees, and relief washed over him like a wave. "We made it," he said, turning to the bear. The bear, however, seemed hesitant. It sniffed the air, its ears twitching. Jake knelt down, looking into its eyes. "Listen, this is the best place for you. They'll take care of your paw and make sure you're safe. You've got to trust me." As if understanding his words, the bear let out a soft huff and began to follow Jake toward the center. The staff at the center were initially stunned to see Jake and the bear approaching. A woman with a clipboard and a kind smile stepped forward. "You brought a wild bear here?" she asked, her tone both incredulous and impressed. "It's injured," Jake explained. "I found it caught in a trap. It's been following me ever since." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "You did the right thing. We'll take it from here." Jake hesitated as the staff led the bear into the building. He felt an ache in his chest, as though he was saying goodbye to an old friend. "Take care of him," he said softly. Days turned into weeks, and Jake couldn't stop thinking about the bear. He called the Wildlife Center for updates, learning that the bear's paw was healing well and that it had become something of a celebrity among the staff. "It's rare for a bear to form a bond with a human like that," the woman from the center told him during one call. "You saved its life, and it seems to know that." Jake spent his days hiking through the forest, retracing the steps of their journey. The wilderness felt different now, less like a vast, indifferent landscape and more like a place of connection and purpose. He began volunteering at the Wildlife Center, helping with injured animals and sharing his story. Each time he recounted the events, he felt the emotional weight of it all over again. The fear, the determination, and the unshakable bond he had formed with the bear. One crisp morning, Jake received a call from the center. "We're releasing the bear back into the wild tomorrow," the woman said. "We thought you might want to be here." Jake's heart leapt. "I'll be there." The next day, he arrived at the center to find the bear waiting in a large enclosure. Its paw was fully healed, and it looked stronger than ever. "You're free now, big guy," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. The staff opened the gate, and the bear stepped out, sniffing the air. It turned to look at Jake one last time, their eyes locking in a moment of silent understanding. Then, with a mighty stride, it disappeared into the forest. Jake watched until the bear was out of sight, tears streaming down his face. He knew he would never forget the creature that had changed his life. Jake continued to work with the Wildlife Center, using his experience to advocate for animal conservation and educate others about the dangers of poaching. His story spread far and wide, inspiring countless people to care for the natural world. He often thought about the bear, wondering how it was faring in the wild. On his hikes, he sometimes imagined he saw a flash of fur or heard the faint echo of a growl, as though the bear were watching over him. In the end, Jake knew their bond would never truly be broken. The wilderness had brought them together, and its lessons would stay with him forever. If this story moved you, consider supporting wildlife conservation efforts in your area. Together, we can protect these incredible creatures and the habitats they call home. Share this video to spread awareness, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that connect us to the beauty and resilience of the natural world.